I purchased my home 15 years ago, long before there was any talk of a homeowners association or planned community. The property had always captivated me with its unique charm and layout. My house sits back from the main road, accessed by a long, winding private driveway that cuts through what was once all undeveloped land. The original developer had designed the property with this special access point, giving it a sense of privacy and seclusion that I had fallen in love with immediately. The driveway curves gently through a stand of mature oak trees before opening up to my modest but well-maintained two-story colonial home. I had been drawn to the property not just for the house itself, but for the land and the privacy it afforded. As a software engineer who works from home, having that buffer between my workspace and the outside world was essential for my productivity and mental well-being. When I first moved in, the surrounding area was mostly undeveloped parcels and a few scattered older homes. The nearest neighbor was a friendly elderly couple who lived a quarter-mile down the road. We would occasionally wave to each other when collecting mail, but otherwise, I enjoyed my peaceful solitude. My brother helped me install property markers along the boundaries after I moved in, and I vividly remember him joking about how much land I had acquired for the price. Over the years, the area began to change. A developer purchased the large tract of land surrounding much of my property and began constructing an upscale subdivision called Oak Grove Estates. I watched with mixed feelings as roads were paved, infrastructure installed, and cookie-cutter houses began to populate what had once been woods and fields. The construction noise was irritating, but I reminded myself that progress was inevitable. About 5 years ago, when the development was nearly complete, the new residents formed an HOA. I received a polite letter inviting me to join, explaining the benefits of being part of the community despite my property predating the development. At first, I declined, preferring to maintain my independence. However, after some consideration and several conversations with new neighbors who seemed reasonable, I reluctantly agreed to join under the condition that my property's original features would be grandfathered in. Initially, the relationship with the HOA was cordial. There were occasional minor disputes about things like my mailbox design or the natural landscaping I preferred over manicured lawns, but we always reached reasonable compromises. I even attended the monthly meetings regularly, finding them mostly benign if somewhat tedious. The original HOA president was a retired school principal named Barbara who approached her role with fairness and common sense. When questions arose about my private driveway and how it connected to their main road, I shared my property survey showing clear ownership. Barbara acknowledged the unusual arrangement but respected the legal boundaries. "Your property was here first," she said reasonably. "We will work around what exists." Everything changed 8 months ago when Barbara and several board members stepped down after completing their terms. The election brought in a new president, Richard Stevens, a former corporate executive with slick-back hair, and a penchant for expensive suits that seemed out of place at community meetings. His campaign had focused on enhancing property values and strengthening community standards, phrases that would soon become weapons against homeowners like me. The first meeting with the new board had a noticeably different tone. Richard banged his gavel with unnecessary force, cutting off questions and rushing through agenda items with corporate efficiency. I left that meeting with an uneasy feeling in my stomach. Something had shifted in our small community, and I sensed that my peaceful coexistence with the HOA might be coming to an end. The first sign of trouble arrived 3 weeks after Richard Stevens took office. I heard the distinctive clatter of my mail slot on a Tuesday morning and found an official-looking envelope bearing the Oak Grove Estates HOA logo lying on my hardwood floor. I opened it while preparing my morning coffee, expecting the usual newsletter or announcement about upcoming community events. Instead, I found a formal letter informing me that my driveway was in violation of community aesthetic standards. According to the letter, my private drive disrupted the visual continuity of the neighborhood and needed to be brought into compliance with Section 8.3 of the HOA guidelines regarding exterior hardscaping. The letter gave me 30 days to submit plans for modification or face fines of $100 per day. I read the letter 3 times, my coffee growing cold beside me. This was absurd. My driveway had existed long before the development. It was clearly marked on my property deed and the original survey. More importantly, its grandfathered status had been explicitly acknowledged when I joined the HOA. I crafted a polite but firm response, attaching copies of the original agreement and property documents. I explained the history of my property and reminded the board that my driveway was explicitly excluded from HOA jurisdiction in my membership agreement. My letter concluded with a request for the citation to be withdrawn, maintaining a civil tone despite my growing frustration. The response came faster than I expected. A new letter arrived just 1 week later, this one written in a more threatening tone. It dismissed my documentation as irrelevant to current community standards and insisted that all properties must conform to the aesthetic guidelines without exception. The deadline remained unchanged. When I called Richard directly to discuss the matter, his tone was superficially pleasant but underlined with condescension. "We all need to make sacrifices for the greater good of the community," he said, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "Your driveway access point creates an inconsistency in our community's appearance. The board feels very strongly about this." "But my property predates the development," I countered. "The driveway is part of my legally deeded property." "Well," Richard replied with a chuckle that made my skin crawl, "perhaps it is time to reassess what constitutes your property and what constitutes community access ways. Times change, and we all need to adapt." The conversation ended with nothing resolved, but his words about reassessing my property boundaries left me deeply unsettled. That night, I pulled out my property documents from the filing cabinet, papers I had not reviewed in years. I spread them across my dining room table, tracing my finger along the clearly marked property lines. What I noticed made me sit up straight in sudden realization. According to the survey, my property line extended not just to the driveway, but actually ran through what was now the main entrance gate to Oak Grove Estates. When the development was built, they had constructed their grand entrance partially on my land, probably assuming the sliver of property was part of their purchased parcel. How had this been overlooked? Over the next few weeks, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Neighbors who had once been friendly began avoiding eye contact. I overheard whispers at the local grocery store about the difficult homeowner who would not cooperate with community improvements. Some neighbors remained neutral or sympathetic in private conversations, but stayed silent in public forums. My mailbox began filling with violation notices for increasingly trivial issues. A garden hose left visible for too long, a trash can that remained at the curb until evening, natural woodland plants in my back garden deemed weeds by the board. Each came with escalating fines that I refused to pay, citing harassment. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when I returned from a rare day at the office to find a construction notice taped to my mailbox. It announced plans to reconfigure community access points for improved traffic flow and security, beginning the following Monday. The detailed plans, attached in small print, included completely removing my private driveway entrance and rerouting access through a side street that would add 5 minutes to my daily commute. They were planning to seize control of my driveway without my permission. This was no longer about aesthetics or community standards. This was an outright land grab, and Richard Stevens had severely underestimated who he was dealing with. The morning after finding the construction notice, I called in sick to work and drove straight to the county record's office. The building was an unremarkable government structure, all fluorescent lighting and linoleum floors that squeaked beneath my shoes as I made my way to the property records department. "I need to confirm my property boundaries," I told the clerk, a helpful woman named Margaret with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "And I need copies of all original surveys and title documents." Margaret led me to a large table where I could spread out documents. "Property disputes?" she asked knowingly as she brought over the first stack of records. "You could say that," I replied. "My HOA seems to think they own part of my land." She made a sympathetic clicking sound with her tongue. "Not the first time I have heard that story. Been working here 30 years, and HOAs have gotten more aggressive over time. Let me pull everything we have got." For the next 4 hours, I pored over maps, surveys, and property records dating back decades. The original subdivision of the land, the sale to the first developer, my purchase 15 years ago, and finally, the development of Oak Grove Estates. Margaret brought me more documents than I had expected, including the developer's plans for the subdivision. What I found confirmed my suspicions and revealed something even more significant. Not only did my property line encompass my entire driveway, but it also cut directly through what was now the grand entrance gate to Oak Grove Estates. When they built their stone pillars and electronic gate system, they had placed nearly a third of it on my property, apparently never checking the exact property lines. I overlaid the original survey with the development plans, and there was no ambiguity. The HOA had built their prized entrance, the focal point featured in all their marketing materials, partially on my land. This was not just a matter of a driveway aesthetic dispute. They were technically trespassing and had been for years. "Would you mind certifying these copies?" I asked Margaret, selecting the most relevant documents. "And could I get an official statement confirming these boundaries?" Margaret smiled. "County records are public documents. I would be happy to provide certified copies with the official seal." That afternoon, I met my friend Thomas for coffee. Thomas and I had been college roommates, and he now practiced real estate law in a firm downtown. I had called him on my way from the records office, and he had agreed to meet me during his lunch break. "This is fascinating," Thomas said, examining the documents spread between our coffee cups. He circled key sections with his pen and made notes in the margins. "They constructed their main entrance on your property without permission or easement. That is pretty much a slam dunk case if it goes to court." "But what about the immediate issue?" I asked. "They plan to start construction on my driveway on Monday." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "First, we document everything. Take date-stamped photos of your property as it currently exists. Next, I suggest a strongly worded letter citing trespass law and property rights, but do not reveal your trump card about their gate yet. Let us see how they respond to the initial pushback. And if they proceed anyway, then we file for an emergency injunction and prepare for a more aggressive legal approach. But honestly, once they realize you have solid documentation, they should back down. HOAs are notorious bullies, but they typically fold when faced with clear legal opposition." Thomas also pointed out several critical sections in the HOA bylaws I had brought along. "See here," he said, "even their own regulations require a property owner's consent before any modifications to private property. and this section limits their authority to aesthetic regulations, not structural changes to access points. They are violating their own rules. I spent the evening researching similar cases online. I discovered dozens of stories about HOA overreach across the country, boards that had attempted to seize property, impose ridiculous restrictions, or bully homeowners into compliance. Many homeowners had fought back successfully once they understood their rights and gathered proper documentation. By morning, my home office walls were covered with documents, maps, and sticky notes forming a timeline of events. I had created a detailed file documenting every interaction with the HOA since the new board took over. Each violation notice, each email exchange, notes from phone conversations, all meticulously organized and dated. Before dawn the next day, I walked my property line with a camera, taking clear photographs of the boundaries, the driveway, and especially the HOA gate where it encroached on my land. The morning light cast long shadows across the property markers that had stood quietly for 15 years, silent witnesses to the boundaries that would soon become a battleground. As I photographed the main entrance gate, a security guard approached me suspiciously. "Can I help you?" he asked, eyeing my camera. "Just documenting my property," I replied calmly, knowing I was well within my rights. "Have a good day." I returned home with a strange sense of calm. Knowledge was power, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the balance of power shifting in my favor. The HOA had picked the wrong homeowner to bully. The weekend passed in tense anticipation. Sunday evening, I received an email from Richard with the subject line "Final Reminder. Construction begins tomorrow." The message was brief and contained no acknowledgement of my objections, just a rehearsed statement about community improvements and a reminder to remove any vehicles from the driveway by 7:00 a.m. I printed the email, added it to my documentation file, and set my alarm for 5:30 a.m. That night, I barely slept, rehearsing what I would say and do when the inevitable confrontation occurred. The mechanical whir of heavy equipment woke me before my alarm. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the window. It was 6:15 a.m., and a small construction crew was already setting up at the end of my driveway. A yellow backhoe was positioning itself, its metal teeth gleaming in the early morning light. Richard Stevens stood nearby in a crisp button-down shirt and khakis, clipboard in hand, directing the workers with authoritative gestures. I dressed quickly, grabbed my folder of documents and stepped outside. My heart pounded in my chest, but my voice remained steady when I called out, "This is private property. You need to stop work immediately." The construction workers paused, looking uncertainly between me and Richard. One worker, a younger man with a concerned expression, switched off his equipment. Richard stepped forward, that same condescending smile fixed on his face. "Good morning. As communicated, we are beginning the Community Access Improvement Project today. If you have concerns, you can raise them at the next board meeting." "There will not be a next board meeting if you do not remove this equipment from my property right now," I stated firmly. "I have documentation proving this driveway is entirely within my property line. Any modifications without my written consent constitute trespassing and property damage." Richard's smile faltered slightly before returning with forced brightness. "The board has reviewed the situation and determined this is a community access point subject to HOA regulation. Now, if you will excuse us." He turned back to the workers. "Continue, please." The younger worker looked uncomfortable but reached for the ignition switch. I stepped directly in front of the backhoe. "I have contacted my attorney," I announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. He has prepared an emergency injunction that will be filed within the hour if you do not cease and desist. Additionally, each of you personally, I looked at the workers, could be named in the lawsuit for knowingly trespassing after being informed of property boundaries. This caught their attention. The workers exchanged glances, and the older crew member stepped away from his machine. "We do not want any legal trouble," he said to Richard. "You assured us all permissions were in place." By now, several neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching the confrontation unfold from their driveways. Richard noticed the audience and visibly stiffened. "We will temporarily postpone today's work," he announced as if it were his idea. "The board will address these unfounded claims and proceed according to schedule once this misunderstanding is clarified." As the workers began reluctantly packing up their equipment, Richard approached me with his voice lowered. "You are making a serious mistake. The board has sufficient authority to proceed regardless of your objections. This delay only makes you look difficult in front of your neighbors." "Send all future communications through my attorney," I replied, handing him a business card with Thomas's information. "And I suggest you carefully review your property boundaries before proceeding with any construction. You might be surprised by what you find." Richard's eyes narrowed at my cryptic warning, but he said nothing more before striding off to his luxury SUV parked nearby. That afternoon, an emergency HOA meeting was called via email. The subject line read, "Addressing problem residents and community progress." The not-so-subtle message was clear. I was being positioned as the villain standing in the way of community improvements. The meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. at the community center. I arrived 15 minutes early with my documentation organized in a professional portfolio. The room was already packed, with residents sitting in clearly divided sections. Richard's supporters, mostly newer homeowners, sat to the right. Those who had been quietly sympathetic to me sat on the left. A few undecided neighbors occupied the middle rows, looking uncomfortable. The board members entered and took their seats on the raised platform at the front of the room. The physical elevation was not lost on me, a clear power dynamic placing the board above the community members. Richard called the meeting to order with an unnecessarily loud bang of his gavel. "We have called this emergency meeting to address a situation that threatens our community improvement initiatives," Richard began, his voice projecting authority. "As many of you witnessed this morning, our efforts to enhance security and traffic flow were obstructed by a resident who seems unwilling to embrace community standards." For the next 20 minutes, Richard presented a one-sided account of the situation, complete with digitally altered photos showing how unsightly my driveway was compared to their proposed uniform entrance. He never mentioned me by name but repeatedly referred to problem residents who place individual preferences above community welfare. When Richard finally called me forward to explain my position, his tone suggested he was extending a courtesy rather than acknowledging my right to speak. I walked calmly to the front of the room, placing my portfolio on the table. "Thank you for the opportunity to address the community," I began politely. "There seems to be some confusion about property boundaries and HOA authority that I would like to clarify." I opened my portfolio and removed the certified property survey, unfolding it on the table. "This is my property survey, certified by the county records office yesterday. As you can all clearly see, my property line encompasses not only my entire driveway but also extends to and through what is now the main entrance gate to Oak Grove Estates." A murmur rippled through the room. Richard attempted to interrupt, but I continued steadily. The HOA has constructed its main entrance gate partially on my private property without permission, easement, or compensation. Before threatening to modify my driveway, perhaps the board should address its own trespassing issues. The room erupted in whispers and exclamations. One board member leaned over to examine the survey, his face paling visibly. Richard attempted to regain control, banging his gavel repeatedly, but the damage was done. Residents were standing up, asking questions, demanding explanations. "This meeting is adjourned," Richard finally shouted above the noise. "The board will investigate these claims and reconvene at a later date." As he hastily gathered his papers and stormed out, several neighbors approached me, examining the survey with newfound respect and interest. "We had no idea," one woman said. "They told us everything was properly permitted and approved." As I walked to my car that evening, 3 longtime residents stopped me in the parking lot. "We have issues with the board too," one confided. "Maybe it is time we compared notes." The battle lines had been drawn, but for the first time I was not standing alone. The following morning, I called Thomas and briefed him on everything that had transpired at the meeting. He listened intently, occasionally interjecting with questions about specific reactions or statements from board members. "You have definitely got their attention," he said when I finished. "But Richard does not strike me as someone who will back down easily. His type tends to double down when challenged publicly. We need to formalize our approach." 2 days later, I sat in Thomas's office signing a formal retainer agreement. His corner office projected quiet confidence with its leather-bound law books and framed credentials. As I signed the document, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. This was no longer just me against the HOA. I now had professional support. "I have drafted a cease and desist letter," Thomas said, sliding a document across his desk. The letterhead of his prestigious firm topped the page, instantly lending gravity to the words below. It cites the relevant property laws, documents the encroachment of the HOA gate on your land, and demands all plans to modify your driveway be permanently abandoned. I read through the letter, impressed by its precise legal language and unambiguous demands. "And if they ignore this?" "Then we proceed to Phase 2, Thomas replied, tapping a second folder. "I have already prepared the documentation for a restraining order and potential lawsuit for trespassing, attempted conversion of property, harassment, and several other causes of action. But let us see how they respond to this first salvo." The certified letter was delivered to the HOA board the following day. I knew it had arrived when Richard called me directly, his voice strained as he attempted to maintain his usual condescending tone. "This legal posturing is unnecessary and harmful to community relations," he began without even a greeting. "I propose we meet privately to discuss a compromise that works for everyone." "All communication should go through my attorney," I replied calmly. "As stated in the letter, involving lawyers escalates a simple neighborhood matter into something needlessly adversarial," he countered, his voice taking on a persuasive quality. "We are all neighbors here." "Neighbors respect property boundaries," I responded before ending the call. While waiting for the official response from the HOA board, I began meeting with other homeowners who had reached out after the confrontational meeting. The first gathering took place in Sarah's living room. She had been one of the first residents of Oak Grove Estates and had grown increasingly concerned about the board's aggressive tactics. 5 homeowners attended that first meeting, each sharing stories about their interactions with the new board. Michael, a retired engineer, described how the board had fined him repeatedly for his ham radio antenna despite its protection under federal law. Jennifer explained how she had been harassed about her garden beds being 2 inches taller than regulations permitted. Each story revealed a pattern of overreach and intimidation. "They count on most people giving in rather than fighting," said David, who had lived in the community for 8 years. "The previous board was reasonable. This new group seems to enjoy the power trip." I shared copies of my property survey and the legal research Thomas had provided about HOA limitations. "There are actual legal boundaries to their authority," I explained. "Many of their demands exceed what they can legally enforce." Our informal group grew with each meeting. We moved from living rooms to the local library's community room to accommodate everyone. I was careful to document each meeting, recording dates, attendees, and topics discussed. Thomas had advised me to maintain meticulous records of everything related to the dispute. During this time, I continued gathering evidence of the HOA's pattern of selective enforcement and overreach. I photographed similar violations that went unpunished at the homes of board members and their friends. I recorded the dates and times of each interaction with board representatives. I requested copies of board meeting minutes that often revealed inconsistencies in how rules were applied. The HOA's formal response to our cease and desist letter arrived 2 weeks later. It was clearly crafted by their attorney, acknowledging the property boundary issue while attempting to claim an implied easement due to the years the gate had been in place. They proposed a settlement. They would formally recognize my ownership through the gate area in exchange for an official easement and the right to standardize my driveway entrance. Thomas was unimpressed with their offer. "They are trying to legitimize their trespass after the fact," he said during our review meeting, "and still demanding control over your driveway. This is a non-starter." We prepared a counter-response rejecting their proposal and including documentation of multiple instances where the board had exceeded its authority with other homeowners. "This demonstrates a pattern of behavior," Thomas explained. "It strengthens our position to show this is not an isolated incident." 3 weeks after the initial confrontation, our group of concerned homeowners had grown to 27 members, nearly a third of the community. We gathered in David's converted garage, which had become our unofficial headquarters. A whiteboard displayed our strategy: document violations, research bylaws, build community support, and prepare for a special election to replace the board. "They have called another emergency meeting for next Tuesday," Jennifer announced, checking her email during our session. "The agenda lists property boundary dispute resolution and board authority clarification." "They are feeling the pressure," I observed. "They know this has grown beyond just my driveway." As our meeting concluded, I felt a new sense of purpose. What had begun as a personal defense of my property rights had evolved into a community standing up against abuse of power. The next board meeting would be the turning point, and we would be prepared. The community center parking lot was filled beyond capacity on the night of the emergency meeting. Residents who typically skipped HOA meetings had turned out in force, curious about the property dispute that had become the neighborhood's primary topic of conversation. I arrived 20 minutes early, accompanied by Thomas and several members of our newly formed homeowners advocacy group. Inside, the tension was palpable. The room had been arranged differently than usual, with the board members' table at the same level as the community seating rather than on the elevated platform they typically used. This subtle change in positioning did not escape my notice, a clear attempt to appear more accessible and less authoritarian. Richard called the meeting to order precisely at 7, 00 p.m. He wore a carefully crafted expression of concerned leadership as he addressed the packed room. "Thank you all for coming tonight on such short notice," he began, his voice modulated to project reasonableness. "As many of you know, our community has been facing some challenges regarding property boundaries and the scope of HOA authority. The board has called this meeting to address these concerns transparently and find a path forward that serves the entire community." The calculated shift in tone was obvious. Gone was the dismissive condescension of previous meetings. Richard was attempting to reclaim the narrative, positioning himself as a reasonable mediator rather than an aggressor. I exchanged knowing glances with Thomas as Richard continued. "Before we open the floor for discussion, I want to provide some context," Richard said. "Oak Grove Estates was designed as a premium community with consistent aesthetic standards that protect all of our property values. The board's primary responsibility is maintaining these standards for everyone's benefit." For the next 15 minutes, Richard presented a carefully revised version of events. He described the driveway dispute as a miscommunication and the construction attempt as an overzealous implementation of approved plans. He acknowledged the property line issue with the main gate, but framed it as a technical oversight from the original development that we are committed to resolving amicably. "Some residents," he continued, looking in my direction without nomming me, "have expressed concerns about the board's methods. While we may disagree on approach, we share the same goal of a beautiful, harmonious community. Tonight, we hope to clear the air and find common ground." As Richard concluded his remarks, he gestured toward me. "I would like to invite our neighbor to share his perspective on these matters." Taking a deep breath, I walked to the front of the room with my portfolio and a sealed tube containing the large format property survey. Thomas gave me an encouraging nod as I placed my materials on the table. "Thank you for the opportunity to address the community," I began, maintaining a calm, measured tone. "What began as a dispute over my driveway has revealed broader issues that affect all of us as homeowners." I recounted the sequence of events factually, without emotional embellishment. The initial violation notice, my documented responses, the escalating fines, and the attempted construction on my property. Rather than responding to my legitimate concerns, the board attempted to seize control of my legally deeded property and failed to disclose that the community's main entrance gate was partially constructed on my land without permission or compensation. I unrolled the large property survey on the table, securing its corners with small weights. This certified survey clearly shows that my property line extends through approximately 1/3 of the main entrance gate structure. This is not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It is a documented legal fact. Several residents stood to get a better view of the survey. A projector had been set up earlier, and Thomas now displayed a digital overlay of the property lines against an aerial view of the community, highlighting exactly where the encroachment occurred. "Beyond my specific situation," I continued, "our research has uncovered numerous instances where the current board has exceeded its authority, selectively enforced rules, and used intimidation rather than proper procedure." One by one, other homeowners began to stand and share their experiences. Michael described the ham radio antenna dispute and how federal law specifically protected his right to install it despite HOA restrictions. Jennifer detailed the arbitrary enforcement of garden height regulations. David recounted being threatened with fines for approved modifications that predated the current board. As more residents spoke, Richard and the other board members whispered urgently among themselves. I could see their confident facade crumbling as the meeting slipped further from their control. Board member Sandra Parker, who had remained largely silent during previous confrontations, looked increasingly uncomfortable. When Richard attempted to adjourn the meeting, citing time constraints, 3 residents simultaneously stood up. "Point of order," called David, who had thoroughly researched the bylaws. "According to Section 5.3 of our community bylaws, any meeting with more than 50% of homeowners present can entertain a motion for immediate board action, including votes of no confidence." "That provision is for emergencies only," Richard countered, his composure slipping. "I believe evidence of board members exceeding their authority and attempting to seize private property constitutes an emergency," Jennifer responded, receiving murmurs of agreement throughout the room. Sandra Parker, the board secretary, suddenly spoke up. "He is right about the bylaw, and I have to say I have been uncomfortable with some of the decisions made recently. I thought we were following proper procedures, but after seeing this documentation—" Richard shot her a warning glance, but the dam had broken. Another board member, Alan Thompson, nodded in agreement with Sandra. "I move that we hold an immediate vote of no confidence in the current board president," called a voice from the back of the room. "And I further move that we form a committee to investigate all recent board actions for compliance with our bylaws and state law." "I second the motion," another resident shouted. Richard banged his gavel repeatedly. "This is out of order. We need to adjourn and consult with our attorney." "Actually," Thomas interjected calmly from his seat, "the motion has been properly made and seconded according to your bylaws. Procedurally, it must be put to a vote." The room fell silent as residents processed what was happening. The balance of power had shifted visibly, with Richard now standing alone as even other board members distanced themselves from his leadership. "All those in favor of a vote of no confidence in the current board president," David called out, "please raise your hands." Hands rose throughout the room, far more than half of those present. Richard's face flushed red as he watched his authority crumble before his eyes. "The motion carries," Sandra announced, her voice shaking slightly as she officially acknowledged the result. "According to our bylaws, the vice president assumes temporary leadership until a special election can be held." As the meeting continued with the vice president now leading, I quietly gathered my documents. The community had spoken, and the first step toward rectifying the power imbalance had been taken. Thomas gave me an approving nod as we watched the process unfold. This was no longer just my fight. It had become a community reclaiming its voice. The weeks following the dramatic meeting brought significant changes to our community. Richard resigned from the board entirely 3 days after the vote of no confidence, selling his house and moving out of the neighborhood within a month. The interim leadership, headed by Vice President James Wilson, immediately suspended all controversial projects pending review, including the planned modifications to my driveway. A special election was held 30 days later, resulting in a completely new board comprised of homeowners committed to transparency and proper procedure. Sarah, from our advocacy group, was elected president, with David and Jennifer also winning seats. Their first official act was to commission an independent review of all board actions taken during Richard's tenure. The property boundary issue was resolved through a formal acknowledgement that the main entrance gate partially encroached on my land. Rather than relocating the expensive structure, the new board proposed a fair compensation agreement and a proper easement contract that respected my ownership while allowing continued community use. The agreement included specific protections for my property rights and a formal apology for the previous board's actions. On a warm Saturday morning, 3 months after the initial confrontation, I watched as workers carefully restored my driveway where the construction crew had damaged the edge. Several neighbors had come to help with landscaping around the repaired area, planting native flowers that complemented both my property